Listen closely because what you are about to hear may shift the way you see every silence, every unanswered message, every emotional wall you've been standing in front of. If someone has ever pulled away when things got real, if someone has ever disappeared the moment your heart opened, this is not the moment you break. This is the moment you rise. Because what feels like rejection is actually revelation. What feels like loss is alignment. And what feels like their power is where it ends. Avoidant psychology thrives on one thing: your pursuit, your questions, your emotional labor, your willingness to keep explaining your worth to someone who benefits from not seeing it. But here, this truth avoidance is not confidence. It is fear wearing armor, and fear cannot stand in the presence of grounded self-respect. You see, avoidant individuals are not running from you. They are running from themselves, from the mirror your authenticity places in front of them, from the responsibility that comes with emotional truth, from the depth they sense but cannot hold. And when you stop chasing their clarity, something profound happens. The dynamic flips. The moment you choose stillness over pursuing, passion, peace over proof, this is where they lose and you win. Divine order never rewards abandonment of self. It rewards alignment. When you stop bending your soul to fit someone else's comfort, you activate a higher law. What is meant for you meets you in wholeness, not in confusion. You were never meant to beg for consistency. You were meant to embody it. Avoidance collapses internally when you no longer react, when your silence is not punishment but peace, when your distance is not strategy but self-honor. They expect emotional chaos. They expect you to chase the gap they created. But when you respond with calm detachment, their nervous system has nothing to feed on. This is wisdom. Not every door that closes is a loss. Some doors close because they were never aligned with your becoming. You don't win by proving your value. You win by knowing it. You don't win by being chosen. You win by choosing yourself so fully that only those capable of presence can stand beside you. And here is the sacred truth: healing makes you unrecognizable to those who benefited from your wounds. When you no longer tolerate emotional inconsistency, avoidance has nowhere to hide. It either rise or retreat. Let it retreat, because your victory was never about them staying. It was about you awakening, stepping into emotional sovereignty, walking in divine self-respect, and realizing that the moment you stop chasing what avoids you is the moment life begins to chase you. This is where they lose, and this is where you win. Avoidance is not random, and it is not accidental. It is rooted deeply in fear of intimacy, fear of accountability, and fear of emotional exposure. At its core, avoidant psychology is not about a lack of feeling, it is about an overwhelming amount of unprocessed feeling. These individuals are often highly sensitive to emotional closeness, not because they do not desire connection, but because connection threatens the inner structures they have built to survive. Intimacy asks them to be seen, and being seen feels dangerous when the self has been conditioned to equate vulnerability with loss, rejection, or shame. Fear of intimacy does not mean fear of people, it means fear of emotional closeness that requires consistency, presence, and truth. Intimacy dissolves the masks. It demands authenticity. For an avoidant, this feels like standing unprotected in emotional daylight. They may crave connection from a distance, but when closeness arrives, their nervous system interprets it as risk. The heart pulls back not because it is cold, but because it learned early that closeness comes with consequences. So withdrawal becomes safety. Distance becomes control. Accountability is the next layer of fear. True connection requires responsibility for words, actions, and emotional impact. Avoidant individuals often fear accountability because it activates guilt, inadequacy, or a sense of being trapped. To be accountable means to acknowledge another person's emotional reality, and that acknowledgement threatens their internal equilibrium. If they admit impact, they must also admit responsibility, and responsibility feels like a loss of freedom. Avoidance then becomes a way to escape the weight of emotional consequence. Emotional exposure is the deepest fear of all. Exposure requires the willingness to be known without guarantees. It means allowing someone to witness flaws, needs, and desires without certainty of acceptance. For avoidance, this exposure feels like a loss of control over their inner world. They often learn, self-regulate alone, to rely on distance rather than dialogue, and to manage discomfort by shutting down instead of opening up. Emotional exposure threatens the illusion of self-sufficiency they depend on to feel safe. This is why avoidant behavior can look confusing or contradictory. They may show interest, warmth, or even intensity, but retreat the moment emotional depth is required. The retreat is not rejection of the other person, it is self-protection from internal overwhelm. Their system is not rejecting love, it is rejecting the vulnerability love requires. Silence, emotional detachment, or sudden withdrawal are not acts of cruelty, they are survival responses that once served a purpose. Understanding this does not mean excusing the behavior. Fear explains, but it does not justify harm. Avoidance shifts the emotional burden onto others, forcing them to carry uncertainty, confusion, and unmet needs. The avoidant avoids pain by transferring it. This is where the dynamic becomes unbalanced. One person is left doing the emotional labor while the other escapes into distance. When you recognize that avoidance is fear-based, something powerful happens. You stop personalizing T, but did an air withdrawal. You stop chasing explanations. You stop trying to prove safety to someone who has not yet learned to feel safe within themselves. And in that awareness, you begin to reclaim your own emotional authority. Fear loses its grip not through force, but through clarity. Silence, distance, and withdrawal are often mistaken for strength, emotional control, or self-mastery, but in avoidant psychology, they are strategies of control rather than expressions of inner power. True strength is the ability to stay present with discomfort, to communicate honestly, and to hold emotional tension without disappearing. Avoidant behavior moves in the opposite direction. It seeks relief, not resolution. It seeks escape, not understanding. And that escape is achieved by controlling access, controlling conversation, closeness, and emotional availability. Silence becomes a tool because it creates uncertainty. When one person withdraws without explanation, the other is left filling the gaps with questions, self-doubt, and emotional labor. This imbalance gives the avoidant a sense of control without having to engage. They are no longer required to explain, clarify, or respond. In that quiet, the feeling of dominance over the emotional environment. But dominance is not stability. Control is not confidence. It is a reaction to inner unease. Distance works in the same way. Physical or emotional distance allows the avoidant to regulate their nervous system by reducing stimulation. Closeness activates vulnerability, distance deactivates it. By pulling away, they create a buffer between themselves and emotional demand. This buffer gives the illusion of independence, but it is actually avoidance disguised as autonomy. Independence rooted in fear is not freedom, it is isolation carefully framed as self-protection. Withdrawal is the most powerful control strategy because it removes access altogether. When someone withdraws, they decide when interaction begins and ends. They determine the emotional temperature of the relationship without discussion. This can feel empowering to someone who fears being emotionally overwhelmed or exposed. Yet this empowerment is fragile. It depends on the other person remaining engaged, confused, or emotionally invested. Once the other person stops reacting, the control collapses. The key illusion in avoidant behavior is the belief that final distance equals emotional strength. In reality, emotional strength is revealed through capacity to listen, to respond, to repair, and to remain present when things are uncomfortable. Avoidance bypasses this growth. It avoids the internal work required to develop emotional endurance. Silence does not mean peace, it often means suppression. Distance does not mean clarity, it often means fear. Withdrawal does not mean self-respect, it often means self-protection taken too far. Control strategies are always compensations. They arise when someone does not feel internally secure enough to remain open. By managing the external environment through silence or absence, they attempt to manage the internal discomfort they cannot yet face. This is why avoidant control is reactive, not intentional. It is driven by the need to regulate anxiety, shame, or vulnerability, rather than by conscious emotional leadership. For the person on the receiving end, this dynamic can feel destabilizing. Silence invites overthinking. Distance triggers insecurity. Withdrawal creates a sense of abandonment. The avoidant avoids their own discomfort by creating discomfort in someone else. This transfer of emotional weight is subtle but profound. It places the responsibility for connection on the person who is still present, while the avoidant remains hidden behind absence. Recognizing silence and withdrawal as control strategies rather than strength changes the power dynamic. You stop interpreting absence as superiority. You stop assuming distance means confidence. You begin to see that real power does not need to disappear. It does not need to withhold. It does not need to confuse. True strength stays. It communicates. It faces what is uncomfortable instead of controlling it from afar. Avoidant dynamics collapse at the moment you stop chasing clarity because the entire system depends on your participation in the confusion. As long as you are seeking answers, explanations, or emotional resolution from someone who withholds it, you remain tied to the cycle. The chase itself becomes the connection. Your questioning becomes the thread that keeps the dynamic alive. But when that thread is withdrawn, something unexpected happens. The structure begins to destabilize, not because you are doing something to them, but because you are no longer doing something for them emotionally. Chasing clarity is often mistaken for emotional intelligence or healthy communication, but in avoidant relationships, it becomes a form of self-abandonment. You start to believe that if you can just ask the right question, say the right words, or express your feelings more precisely, the other person will finally open up. But avoidance is not a puzzle to be solved through better communication. It is a pattern of disengagement that feeds on your continued engagement. The more you reach, the more space they take. The more you explain, the less they respond. Not because your effort is wrong, but because their comfort is maintained by your pursuit. When you stop chasing clarity, you remove the emotional leverage that silence once held over you. Silence is powerful only when it creates movement in you, when it makes you anxious, reactive, or uncertain enough to keep reaching. But when silence meets stillness, it loses its function. It no longer pulls you into overthinking. It no longer dictates your emotional state. Instead, it is met with neutrality. And neutrality is something avoidance cannot manipulate, because there is no reaction to feed on. In this space of non-chasing, something important becomes visible. Clarity was never going to come from them in the way you imagined. Avoidant individuals often operate in emotional ambiguity, not because they are calculating harm, but because clarity requires confrontation with feelings they have not learned to process. So they remain in half states, half present, half available, half engaged. And in that half state, you are kept in full emotional investment while they remain partially detached. This imbalance is what sustains the cycle. The collapse begins when you withdraw your need for resolution from their hands, not because you no longer care, but because you no longer outsource your peace. At first, this creates discomfort because the nervous system is conditioned to seek completion. The mind wants closure. The heart wants understanding. But growth begins where dependency ends. When you stop chasing clarity, you begin to tolerate uncertainty without turning it into emotional chaos. This shift changes the entire dynamic. The avoidant no longer experiences your pursuit as reassurance of their importance. They no longer receive the subtle reinforcement that their distance is still holding your attention. And without that force, the pattern loses its stability. What remains is reality without pursuit, silence without interpretation, distance without chase, absence without emotional escalation. It is in this stillness that your own power becomes visible. You begin to realize that clarity was never something they were consistently capable of giving. And more importantly, you recognize that your peace was never meant to depend on their emotional availability. The moment you stop chasing answers from someone committed to ambiguity, you reclaim the energy that was being spent on trying to decode inconsistency. This is where the internal shift happens. You are no longer negotiating with silence. You are no longer translating confusion into hope. You are no longer participating in the emotional instability that requires your constant interpretation. And in that withdrawal of pursuit, the dynamic does not just change, it dissolves its grip on you. Self-respect changes the entire architecture of a relationship dynamic more than confrontation ever could, because confrontation still operates within the same emotional system. It still engages, still reacts, still seeks resolution from the other person. Self-respect, however, removes the need for permission altogether. It is not loud, it is not reactive, and it does not require the other person to acknowledge it for it to be real. It is a quiet but decisive shift from emotional dependency to emotional sovereignty. And in avoidant dynamics, that shift is deeply disruptive to the established pattern. When someone is avoidant, they often unconsciously rely on the other person's continued emotional availability to maintain control of distance. As long as you are available, waiting, explaining, or hoping, the dynamic remains stable in their favor. They can step forward and step back without consequence, because there is always a door open. But the moment self-respect enters the equation, that door is no longer automatically accessible. You begin to respond differently, not from anger, not from manipulation, but from alignment with your own emotional truth. Self-respect expresses itself through boundaries that do not require negotiation. It is the decision to no longer overextend yourself to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding your emotional presence. It is the refusal to chase clarity where consistency should have existed, then naturally. And it is the quiet realization that your emotional energy is not a resource to be spent proving your worth to someone who benefits from your uncertainty. What makes self-respect powerful in this context is that it removes predictability. Avoidant dynamics often depend on a predictable emotional response. You reach, they withdraw, you question, they distance further, you wait, they reappear. This cycle creates a rhythm that feels familiar even when it is painful. But when self-respect interrupts that rhythm, the system loses its structure. You are no longer responding in the expected ways. You are no longer reinforcing the cycle with emotional pursuit or explanation. Instead, you are anchored in your own boundaries, and that anchoring creates uncertainty in the dynamic, not chaos, but clarity that cannot be controlled. From a psychological standpoint, this shift is significant because avoidant behavior is often stabilized by low accountability environments. When there are no emotional consequences for withdrawal, avoidance continues. But when your presence is no longer guaranteed, when your attention is no longer automatic, when your emotional availability is no longer unseen, the dynamic begins to change. Not because you are punishing, but because you are no longer participating in imbalance. Self-respect does not demand that others change, it simply removes your participation in what diminishes you. And that removal is what creates the perception of loss in the avoidance system. They are not necessarily losing a person in the traditional sense, they are losing access to emotional predictability. They are losing the comfort of inconsistency being tolerated. They are losing the ability to engage without responsibility. For you, this becomes a turning point. You stop measuring your value by someone else's capacity to meet you. You stop interpreting distance as something to fix. You stop negotiating your own emotional needs in order to maintain proximity. Instead, you begin to operate from a place where your standards are internal, not reactive. Your worth is no longer being decided in moments of absence or return. This is why self-respect is more powerful than confrontation. Confrontation seeks change in the other person. Self-respect creates change in you, and that change alters everything around you without a single argument. It shifts the emo field. It ends cycles without explanation, and it quietly establishes a truth that cannot be argued with. You are no longer available for dynamics that require you to abandon yourself in order to be included. Emotional consistency is one of the most revealing forces in avoidant dynamics because it acts like a mirror that cannot be easily distorted. Avoidant psychology often survives in environments where emotional signals are unpredictable, where presence and absence alternate, and where intensity replaces steadiness. In that kind of emotional climate, inconsistency can be normalized, even expected. But when emotional consistency enters the space, calm, stable, grounded presence without emotional extremes, it begins to reflect back something that avoidance cannot comfortably process: clarity. For an avoidant individual, emotional closeness is already challenging, but emotional consistency intensifies that challenge in a different way. It removes the chaos that they unconsciously rely on to regulate distance. When someone is inconsistent, an avoidant can move in and out without feeling fully seen or fully responsible. There is space to disappear, return, and reset the emotion. Full tone without deep confrontation. But emotional consistency does not allow that fluctuation to go unnoticed. It does not punish, it does not chase, and it does not collapse into emotional extremes. It simply remains steady. This steadiness creates a psychological mirror. It reflects behavior without distortion. If someone withdraws, the consistency does not chase. If someone returns, the consistency does not overreact. If someone creates distance, the consistency does not panic. And because there is no emotional escalation to distract from the pattern itself becomes visible. For someone who has relied on emotional ambiguity, this visibility can feel uncomfortable, even confronting, because it removes the protective layer of confusion. Avoidant individuals are often more accustomed to emotional environments that respond to their inconsistency with either pursuit or emotional volatility. Pursuit reinforces their ability to withdraw without consequence, while volatility gives them something to disengage from. Emotional consistency offers neither. It does not amplify their withdrawal, nor does it collapse into anxiety when they pull away. Instead, it holds a steady emotion baseline. which quietly communicates that connection is not dependent on chasing or proving. This is where the mirror effect becomes significant. Emotional consistency does not expose the avoidant person, it simply reflects what is already happening without distortion. And reflection without distortion can feel intense to someone who is used to emotional responses being shaped by their behavior. When there is no overreaction to their absence, they are faced with the reality of their absence. When there is no desperation in response to their distance, they are faced with the reality of their distance. This can create internal discomfort because it interrupts the familiar cycle of emotional control through unpredictability. At the same time, emotional consistency also reveals the internal state of the person embodying it. It communicates self-regulation, emotional maturity, and grounded presence. It shows that emotional stability is not dependent on external validation or fluctuating behavior. This is important because it removes the unconscious leverage that inconsistency often holds. When someone reacts strongly to every withdrawal, avoidance gains influence. When someone Betty regardless of emotional fluctuation, that influence diminishes. However, emotional consistency is not a tool for control or a strategy to provoke change. It is not about mirroring behavior to influence outcome. Its power lies in its neutrality. It does not escalate, it does not retreat, it does not perform emotional instability to gain connection. It simply remains anchored. And in relationships shaped by avoidance, this anchoring becomes a reference point that cannot be easily ignored. Over time, this mirror effect can create a natural divergence. The avoidant dynamic either adjusts toward greater presence or moves away from the consistency that no longer supports avoidance patterns. In both cases, emotional consistency remains unchanged. It does not bend to absence, and it does not inflate in response to return. It remains aligned with itself, which is what makes it so revealing and, at times, so confronting. Detachment with dignity is not emotional withdrawal in anger, nor is it punishment disguised as silence. It is the conscious decision to release emotional entanglement while preserving inner respect. In avoidant dynamics, where inconsistency often creates emotion, turbulence, dignified detachment introduces something unfamiliar. Calm separation without chaos. And this calmness is precisely what initiates internal reckoning, not through force, but through contrast. Avoidant patterns often rely on emotional push and pull. There is closeness, then distance, attention, then absence. This rhythm creates a subtle form of emotional control because it keeps the other person engaged in anticipation. But detachment with dignity interrupts that rhythm entirely. It removes anticipation as a source of power. When you no longer react emotionally to withdrawal, no longer chase explanations, and no longer collapse into confusion, the dynamic loses its emotional leverage. This kind of detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It does not erase care, it removes dependency. And that distinction is crucial, because avoidant individuals are often accustomed to emotional reactions that signal continued attachment, questions, frustration, attempts to reconnect. These reactions, even when painful, confirm that emotional investment is still active, but dignified detachment removes those signals. It replaces emotional urgency with composed distance. What makes this powerful is that it does not mirror avoidance, it transcends it. Avoidance is reactive, rooted in fear of closeness and responsibility. Dignified detachment is intentional, rooted in self-awareness and emotional sovereignty. One avoids to escape discomfort, the other detaches to preserve alignment. This difference creates a psychological imbalance that cannot be controlled by the avoidant pattern. When someone detaches with dignity, they are no longer participating in the emotional instability that the avoidant system often depends on. There is no emotional escalation to manage, no confusion to interpret, no pursuit to respond to. Instead, there is silence that is not charged with resentment, absence that is not filled with longing, and distance that does not fluctuate based on the other person's behavior. This creates a space that feels unfamiliar because it removes the emotional feedback loop. Avoidant individuals often rely on subtle emotional confirmation that they still hold influence in the dynamic. Even negative reactions confirm relevance, but dignified detachment removes that confirmation entirely. It does not argue, it does not plead, it does not seek resolution through ego intensity. It simply steps back with composure. And in that step back, something begins to shift internally for the avoidant individual, not necessarily immediate regret or realization, but a disruption in their familiar emotional structure. This disruption is what leads to internal reckoning. Reckoning here does not mean dramatic transformation, it means confrontation with emotional absence that cannot be controlled. When someone who once reacted is no longer reacting, when emotional access is no longer available on demand, the avoidance system is faced with a mirror that does not adjust itself to comfort. The absence they created is no longer being filled by pursuit. It stands on its own. Dignified detachment also changes the internal experience of the one practicing it. It replaces emotional reactivity with grounded observation. Instead of interpreting every action or absence as a signal to respond, there is a return to self-reference. Emotional energy is no longer spent decoding inconsistency, but redirected toward inner stability. This shift is subtle but profound because it moves the center of gravity from external behavior to internal alignment. The dignity in detachment, B, is what prevents it from becoming emotional retaliation. There is no attempt to provoke guilt or force realization. There is simply the refusal to remain entangled in a dynamic that requires emotional self-abandonment. And that refusal carries a quiet authority. It communicates that presence is no longer conditional on inconsistency, and access is no longer guaranteed through withdrawal and return cycles. In avoidant psychology, this creates a space that cannot be easily navigated using old patterns. The usual response is distance to regain control, silence to reset emotional intensity, return to re-engage without accountability no longer produce the same effect. The emotional field has changed, and within that change, the avoidant system encounters something it cannot manipulate: stillness that does not collapse. Healing shifts the entire emotional architecture of a person from reaction to sovereignty. In avoidant dynamics, this shift is one of the most transformative changes that can occur because it alters not only how you respond to others, but how you interpret emotional experience itself. Before healing, much of your emotional world is shaped by external behavior: who is present, who is absent, who is consistent, who withdraws. Your nervous system becomes trained to scan for signals, to interpret distance as meaning, and to assign value based on availability. But healing interrupts that external dependency and brings you back into internal authority. When you are operating from reaction, your emotional state is constantly being pulled outward. A delayed message creates anxiety. Withdrawal creates self-doubt. Inconsistency creates overthinking. The avoidant dynamic thrives in this space because reaction keeps you engaged. Even pain becomes a form of connection. But healing begins when reaction is no longer automatic. There is a pause between stimulus and response. In that pause, something new emerges: choice. That choice is the beginning of sovereignty. Sovereignty means your emotional world is no longer dictated by someone else's inconsistency. It does not mean you do not feel, it means your feelings no longer control your direction. You can observe distance without collapsing into it. You can witness withdrawal without chasing it. You can experience uncertainty without turning it into self-abandonment. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional bowed regulation grounded in self-awareness. Avoidant dynamics lose their grip when reaction is replaced with observation. Reaction feeds the cycle because it provides constant engagement. Observation breaks the cycle because it removes urgency. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this?" you begin to ask, "What is this revealing about the pattern?" That shift alone moves you out of emotional entanglement and into clarity. You are no longer inside the confusion, you are witnessing it. Healing also redefines your relationship with silence. In a reactive state, silence feels like abandonment, punishment, or rejection. It becomes a space that must be filled with meaning, often negative meaning. But in a healed state, silence becomes neutral. It is no longer a threat, it is information. It reveals patterns of availability without requiring emotional escalation. This neutrality is a form of sovereignty because it prevents emotional spiraling. Another major shift is the dissolution of emotional bargaining. Before healing, there is often an unconscious negotiation. If I explain more, if I wait longer, if I understand better, things will change. This bargaining keeps you locked in cycles where invested in potential rather than reality. Healing removes the need for negotiation. Reality is accepted as it is, not as it could become through effort alone. This acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. As you move deeper into healing, you begin to recognize that emotional consistency must come from within before it can be expected externally. You stop outsourcing stability. Instead of seeking reassurance from inconsistent sources, you build internal grounding. This internal grounding becomes your reference point. It means your emotional state is no longer dictated by whether someone is present or absent, responsive or withdrawn. In avoidant dynamics, this is where the power structure quietly shifts. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through disengagement from reactivity. The dynamic that once relied on your emotional fluctuation loses its fuel. There is no longer panic to soothe, no longer confusion to resolve, no longer urgency to manage. What remains is steadiness. And in that steadiness, you begin to experience a different kind of clarity, one that does not depend on another person's behavior to be valid. You see patterns without bent. You feel emotions without being ruled by them. You recognize dynamics without needing to fix them. This is sovereignty in its truest form. Not control over others, but freedom from being controlled internally by others. When you choose wholeness, you are no longer operating from the fragmented version of yourself that seeks completion through someone else's presence. Wholeness is not the absence of desire or emotion, it is the integration of them. It is the moment you stop believing that inconsistency, withdrawal, or emotional unavailability must be solved in order for you to feel complete. Instead, you begin to realize that your completeness was never meant to be negotiated through another person's capacity to show up. In avoidant dynamics, fragmentation is often the silent foundation. One person is present inconsistently, and the other adapts by shrinking, overextending, or overinterpreting in order to maintain connection. This creates an internal split. Part of you is anchored in your own truth, while another part is constantly adjusting to someone else's emotional distance. Wholeness begins when that split is no longer sustainable. It is the return to internal alignment, where your emotional needs are not secondary to someone else's availability. Choosing wholeness means you stop building emotional narratives around potential. You stop attaching meaning to moments of temporary closeness that are not supported by consistency. Instead of seeing intermittent presence as progress, you begin to see it as instability. This shift is not cynical, it is clarifying. It removes illusion from emotional interpretation and replaces it with grounded perception. Wholeness also requires you to release the belief that love must be earned through endurance. In avoidance cycles, endurance is often mistaken for loyalty. Waiting longer, explaining more, tolerating more distance, these are unconsciously framed as proof of emotional depth. But wholeness dismantles that belief. It reveals that endurance without reciprocity is self-abandonment, not devotion. Real connection does not require you to diminish yourself in order to remain included. As you move into wholeness, your emotional responses begin to change. Where there was once urgency, there is now observation. Where there was once confusion, there is now recognition. You no longer overinvest in inconsistent signa, because you are no longer using inconsistency as a measure of worth. Instead, you begin to evaluate connection based on presence, clarity, and emotional responsibility. This recalibration is subtle but profound because it redefines what is acceptable in your emotional world. Avoidant dynamics often lose their influence at this stage because they depend on partial engagement. They require your emotional fragmentation to remain active. When you are partially invested, they can remain partially available. But wholeness removes the partial entirely. You are no longer half in and half out emotionally. You are either aligned with what is consistent or no longer engaged with what is not. This clarity disrupts the familiar rhythm of distance and return. Wholeness also brings an end to internal negotiation. You stop asking yourself to tolerate what repeatedly unsettles you. You stop rationalizing inconsistency as complexity. You stop interpreting emotional withdrawal as something you must understand in order to stay connected. Instead, you begin to honor your internal signals without delay. If something repeatedly disrupts your peace, you no longer label it as something to fix you right. Recognize it as something to release. This does not mean emotional hardness. In fact, wholeness increases emotional capacity because it is no longer fragmented by confusion. You are able to feel deeply without losing yourself in what you feel. You can experience connection without dependency. You can acknowledge care without surrendering boundaries. This integration is what makes wholeness powerful. It allows emotion and self-respect to coexist without conflict. In the presence of wholeness, avoidant patterns lose their anchoring effect. The push and pull dynamic no longer finds emotional entry points. There is no overreaction to withdrawal, no collapse into silence, no pursuit of clarity from someone unwilling to provide it. Instead, there is steadiness. And that steadiness does not invite chaos, it neutralizes it. Ultimately, choosing wholeness is not about winning a dynamic with someone else. It is about ending the internal fracture that allowed the dynamic to affect you in the first place. It is the quiet realization that your emotional center no longer moves with someone else's inconsistency. And in that realization, you are no longer trying to become whole through connection, you connecting from a place that is already whole. In closing, understand this. Avoidance only holds power where confusion is allowed to stay. But the moment you return to your own emotional center, the pattern loses its grip. What once felt like distance, silence, or inconsistency becomes clarity instead of chaos, and you are no longer pulled into proving your worth to anyone who cannot meet you in presence. You stop chasing what withdraws, you stop explaining what refuses to understand, and you begin to honor the simple truth that your peace is not negotiable. Real transformation happens when you choose yourself without needing permission, when you stand steady without emotional bargaining, and when you realize that what is meant for you will never require self-abandonment. Thank you for your presence, your attention, and your willingness to reflect deeply. May you carry this awareness forward with strength, clarity, and calm. Goodbye.